For a time, Twilight simply glided, curious if the world was truly an infinite and uniform as it appeared, or if she might still be able to find some answer in the break between the golden rows. Twice more she had called out to Applejack, and both times she had gotten no response. When she had thought she had heard something, a faint distant note that sounded like almost a wavering, plaintive cry, but it had faded before she could get a fix on it and had not reoccurred. She glided farther still, conserving as much energy as possible as she let herself descend back to the field. When she finally landed, she pushed as far as the shade of her row as she could and sat wearily in the dirt. She was thoroughly worn out, and she had a little bit more to show for it, and when she had started, there was no way to know whatever Applejack was really here, but also no way for her to conclude that it wasn't. Perhaps Applejack hadn't heard her calls, but she had flown in the wrong direction without her hearing her friend's desperate replies. Perhaps Applejack was so tired and too tired to answer. But whatever this place is, it was clearly too vast for her to search physically. She needed a different approach. I don't think there would be any question that some kind of magic has to be at play here, she said, glancing around. While it was hardly the outcome she wanted, at least it left her with the tools that she was most familiar with. All she had to do was to figure out what kind of forces might be at play here, where the boundaries overlapped between where she had come from and whatever this place was. She had more than a few spells to try that might yield helpful results. Let's see, spatial analysis, chromatic mapping, or perhaps physical forces test. Or Hawk, why just basic energy read? That at least would tell her some kind of power spell that was active anywhere nearby or around her. Information, any information would help her determine the good next steps. She lowered her horn and closed her eyes, allowing the other senses to reside as she probed in the air into the familiar subtle currents of power. When her eyes shot open and a shrill, piercing screech tore the air, she scrambled her hooves, spinning around wildly as he searched for the source of the sound. It carried on for several seconds, fitting to a high kneeling note before dying away in stuttering broken series of something almost like chirps. Twilight realized her breathing had gone shallow again, and she made an effort to bring herself back under control. "What in the Tartarus?" she whispered. As in response to her own words, leaves rustled somewhere close by. Her eyes darted around, but no motion could be seen yet. Even so, the sounds of something moving towards her were unmistakable. A stem creaked somewhere as bent, then snapped, wet brittle under a heavy thread. Twilight's skin crawled. She suddenly felt the kind of instinctive certainty that she had only experienced in a few nightmares, and that's something she knew exactly where she was, even though she couldn't see it. She took a hesitant few steps back, and then spread her wings and took off without backwards glance. She then flew 10, 20, 50 rows over, throwing every swerve for good measure. When overpowering the surge to run had finally started to fade, she let herself drift back to the yielding earth. She sat still for a few minutes, ears turning in every direction as she listened for any sound of pursuit. There was nothing, at least that she could hear over the relentless drone of cicadas. She sat back and put her hooves over her eyes, pushing down on the emotions that welled up inside her. The scream that had been nothing she had ever heard in all of Equestria. Not ever free beast, nor changeling or magical construct. It had sounded deeper, older, like a shriek of stones on a crumbling cliff, or the creaking roar of the house collapsing under its own strained timbers. But what truly terrified her was a distant impression that it had not been the sound of something in pain or fear or anger. It sounded triumphant. Twilight then took off again, not bothering with altitude, working on to put as much distance as she could between herself and the source of the scream. Row after row of corn vanished beneath her, and crowns brushing against the tips of her hooves as she rushed by, and only when the stitch in her chest had returned, she did consider landing once more. She needed to consider her next course of action. After as short a rest as she could stand away, as she searched for one of the wider paths to take in, or better yet, another clearing, she instead spotted something off to her left, a little bolt rising just above the leaves. It looked like a plant that had risen above the uniform rows of the rest. A tiny dark hole in the horizon with little leaves radiating out like cracks to the sky on all sides of it. Twilight's brow furrowed as she veered out towards it, curious to investigate any change of the unbroken expanse of the fields. She was upon it no time at all, and she was surprised to realize that it was not a corn plant, but a sunflower, the most enormous one that she's ever seen. It rose nearly 5 times her height and stalked nearly half thick as her leg, bristling with white hairs that looked sharp as needles. Its head was bigger than her own and looked as weighty as a watermelon, thrust into the sky to copy the sun's burning rays with its own vibrant yellow petals. Beneath it she saw the golden crowns of more sunflowers, more than a dozen, as all clustered in one single spot like a little thicket. Why would they be growing here and apparently nowhere else? However, this was hardly the most curious thing. No, that's not what the sunflowers had sprouted from. Twilight landed awkwardly among the corn plants surrounding the sunflowers, shoving them unceremoniously aside, and tried to get a closer look. Hunkered down among the stalks was the enormous cart or wagon, laying a mournful, dejected angle, with half of its wheels broken with their axles stabbed into the dirt. Twilight frowned, putting away a worry hoof onto the side of the wagon. It seemed somehow familiar, here, though she couldn't manage without she could have seen such direct convenience. The wood was bleached gray and brittle with age, and most of the boards had been pulled apart, leaving rusty nails to stab viciously into the air. A few brownish flecks of paint remained that one have been red, but it was impossible to tell. Strangest of all, though, there were metal pipes and cabinets that punctured and wove around the wagon's body, leading to a large shattered grass reservoirs bolted on top of it. Reservoirs? Why did the vehicle look so familiar? There was a memory, she was sure of it, lingering just below the surface of consciousness. She couldn't match the shape of the wreck to anything she knew. The entire thing was overrun with sunflowers, which seemed to have sprouted from somewhere within, and she pushed her way out through every crack and crevice that they could find or make. The largest one Twilight had seen afar grew right out on top of the wagon, and snarled of its brown, veiny roots, shrouded in the broken remains of what looked like an enormous glass bulb of some sort. A memory sparked in Twilight's mind, a sight captured lightning sparkling inside a sealed tube. A phonemic vacuum valve? She asked, climbing carefully on top of the wagon's rail. It was hard to be sure that the casing had deteriorated more than any device she had ever seen. The wagon on the whole looked to be about abandoned out there for years, if not longer. Even so, it matched what she knew of the mechanisms for regulating current and magically driven engine, only the seen advance in wealthy cities like Canterlot or Manhattan. Twilight had put her face carefully against a fracture of the wagon's hull and peered inside. Sure enough, the interior was a snarl of cables and machinery, and with a little knowledge she had known of magical engineering, she could spot the places where the vehicle's magic would have been concentrated and channeled, where arrays of gems and glass would have held the powers that charge and propel it. Every such node was choked and strangled with roots, and in many places it almost seemed as if though the shoots had burst from the crystals themselves. That hardly seemed possible, though. A seed would have needed to be placed somehow inside the gems, or else they would have been broken before the seeds were scattered. No flower had roots strong enough to break through quartz, ruby, or sapphire. She pulled away and climbed carefully onto the front of the wagon, up to the wide platform that probably served as its control seat. The whole thing shifted with a groan, agent spring grumblings and crackling as they shed flakes of rust below the running boards. Something crunched under her hoof as she stepped back to see the dry, crumbling remains of a notebook lying open on the deck. She prodded gingerly, wincing as the paper crumbled. It looked as though it might fall into pieces if anyone so much as lifted it. She needed information, though, and this was the closest that she had come to meeting another soul in what had begun to feel like days. She carefully applied the levitation spell, maintaining the equal distribution of force vectors across every surface as she possibly could, and lifted the book up to her eyes. It was in bad shape, worse than the wagon, adding to the apparent years of baking unsheltered in the sun. The paper had been shredded by what Twilight guessed would probably be vermin and insects. Massive swaths were missing entirely, and what remained of the written was in pencil, most of it was faded beyond recognition. She turned the pages with the utmost care, cursing herself when nearly every leaf disintegrated or tore free. From what little could she discern, the notebook had belonged to some kind of tinker or inventor, with the mechanical diagrams, sketches of prototype circuits, and models for the integration of various systems laid out across the surviving pages. Designs for custom spells were evident in the later pages, with the writing growing increasingly shaky and disorganized as they went on. Twilight couldn't make out a single one of its entirety, but she could see that at some point that the spells had shifted from mechanical manipulations to dimensional analysis and bad drafts for the teleportation spell variations. There were other ponies here, she breathed. This just didn't appear. Someone had time to realize what was happening to them, just like me. She wondered if it had gotten anywhere. She looked at the ground behind the wagon and saw the faintest remains of shallow tracks. It looked like it had been driven straight through the corn, unless there had been a path at the time. Either way, the crumpled up body and the wooden plow driven down into the dirt made her think the breakdown had happened while it's in motion. She turned back and looked at the notebook. The last span of pages give way to plain writing, and Twilight guessed it was a logbook of some sort. Unfortunately, these pages were in the worst condition, and most seemed to have been chewed right down to the binding. Only a few paragraphs remained remotely illegible, gouged into the harder paperboard of the back cover, and even these were so smidged that she had spent several minutes picking at the letters apart. Absolutely no evidence, she murmured. Something, corn, no corns. Corns can be found. Employ? Not sure what that's supposed to mean. Farms throughout Equestria. Never heard. Perhaps a question of intensity? Yeah, intensity. She squinted, bringing the book back close to her muzzle as she could without touching it. The last line had been nearly obliterated, and it looked as if though the cover had been both stomped on and soaked with drops of water. Turning to writing the smidge scrawl, something, he won't. Twilight blinked and sucked in a soft gasp. Then the notebook nearly fell apart as her spell wavered. He won't stop following me. She pushed the book away, feeling a shiver of haunch in her shoulders go in her back. She couldn't help but glance around. The plants suddenly felt clustered far too close around her. Their shadows were too thick and deep. She once again felt like she was being watched. I felt the pressure of unseen eyes, lurking somewhere just out of the sight of dense foliage. She suddenly wanted desperately to leave. She hesitated, looking back at the notebook even one more time. Was it even worth taking it with her? There was almost nothing left, and she doubted it would survive a few steps of her carrying it. Still, this was the only connection to Equestria she found, and she was to loathe a part of it. She gave the wreckage another questioning look, wondering what had happened to the inventor who had driven it there. Inventor, contraption, she could practically hear the sound. It would have been her maid bulldozing through breaking stalks, the hissing exhaust of its valves and clattering, clockwork sound of its transmission. Song! What? Her ears fell flat. She backed away off the platform, looking at the whole wreckage once more. The oversized front wheels and the snowy, almost stage-like driver's seat. It can't be. But it was, and she knew it. She couldn't imagine how, but if there it was, she knew how the engine would have sounded because she had heard it before, once, as rattled-up trapped vehicle had rolled up in different site or season not so long ago. Not nearly so long ago as to look so decayed and depleted as she found it. The echoes of voices rolled out over her from memory, as though she could hear them singing far, far away from the rows of watchful corn. Super speedy, the voices sang. Cider squeezy. 6,000, Twilight breathed, turning to the side of the wagon. It would have been there, but she recalled it, just above the shattering glass window and dust-crusted indicator lights of the quality monitor. Logical filtering charms. That name of the contraption would have been painted in bright, flourished letters of golden paint, but nothing remained of it now. Nothing but wood splintering to sawdust, slowly sinking and crumbling into the ground. But even so, there could be little doubt. The brothers Flam had just arrived here, and the same as her, and now her most prized possession was rotted in the dirt. Neither hide or hair of them was to be seen anywhere. Twilight swallowed dryly and set the notebook down. She couldn't decide if this was good news or bad news. After all, it seemed like a hopeful thing to find evidence of other ponies here. Other ponies meant other ears pricked for danger, the other eyes searching for patterns, other heads working out solutions, even if this particular pony's would have hardly had been her first 10 for 100 of choices of allies in her circumstances. But the desolate state of the vehicle seemed an ill omen. She couldn't persuade herself to feel much hope in finding brothers. If Applejack hadn't heard her, they hadn't had heard her when she was so close to above this neglected wreck. She looked around one more time, feeling more alone and lost than she ever had in the sky. She stopped as carefully as she could, gathered up a few pages and dropped and wedged them carefully, respectively back in the covers of the book. She had no love for the brothers, but there was no reason to cause more destruction to their property more than the sun and insects had already done. But as she set the last page among the others, she paused, then pulled it back to hover in front of her again. The page was nearly gone, chewed along the entire length of it. She frowned, noticing the spacing of the marks, their ridges, edges, then slowly and carefully brought up the edge to the rim of their own lower teeth. The arc of the bite lined up almost exactly with her own jaw, and the tear only a little broader within her own smile. It was almost as if the notebook hadn't been chewed on by bugs at all, but rather a pony. Twilight stood up and stepped back, surveying her progress with a critical eye. She spat on the broken stem that she had used to pen out of her mouth, and then wiped her forehead again. It was no longer a question of her imagination. The heat was definitely getting to her. Sweat was running freely down her body at this point, tracing hot virulets through her coat before dripping away to vanish in the dirt. Worse still, simple of examination, the scant shadows confirmed one of her worst suspicions. The sun was still the same spot in the sky as it had been when she had first entered the maze, in spite of how long she had flown that day, putting another valley's worth of distance between herself and the remains of SSCS 6000, to say nothing of the hours that she had spent searching for Applejack or fleeing that strange piercing cry. The day hadn't advanced towards night in the slightest. Time had not been behaving normally, as was not much of a surprise to her now. In a strange way, it did offer her one source of comfort. It gave the possible explanation to the advanced state of decay and Flam Brothers' machine, and she would make any scrap of sanity in this place care to restore her. Endless heat. However, she was still proving to be a hazard of itself. The world couldn't have waited until sunset for things to go crazy, could it? She sighed. A nice cool evening with plenty of shade. At least she had light to work with. She could have ended up in here in total darkness. If it ever got dark in this place, she wouldn't imagine that it would be better in under any circumstances. Still, if time was not behaving normally, her body was. She was thirsty, and dirt had begun to clung her sweaty coat like a second skin. The ground beneath her hooves was dry and hard. Little puffs of dust had begun to spring up whenever she stepped. Twilight felt her gaze pulled from the work at her hooves over to the edge of the clearing, where rows of corn hemmed her in. She could see plenty of cobs, thick and heavy in their wrappings of leaves, and even the shine of plump nuggets of gold peeking out from the openings of the rupskit's husks. Her stomach grumbled, and her dry mouth yearned for a tear a cob free bite into their cool, juicy flesh. She forced herself to turn away. Her body needed nourishment, and if she didn't find any water source she could trust soon, she knew she would start to feel truly sick, and she was wary of consuming anything she found in the world that she didn't understand. And as long as she felt like she could continue on, it seemed best to play it safe while she still could. If I had brought more materials of my own, she sighed. She could conjure wings from spider webs do, or door from splinters and the bile of annoyance itself, but food and water of any substantial benefits were far more energy intensive, and even when she couldn't make them nothing but air. As for plants, any water she pulled would be just as suspect as anything else from this world. She would consider it as her last resort. Besides the feeling of being watched, that was something she knew where she was, even after that long winding fights she had taken to reach this point, still remained with her. It had weakened, settling from a deep, sour terror in her chest and into a vague squirming nausea in the corner of her gut. It never truly fully left her, though it was sooner she could find a way back, the sooner she addressed the majority of her problems. As for Applejack, I don't even know if you're here or not, she whispered, but either way I need your help. We both need help. My best chances of helping you is gain more resources on your side. She took another long breath, then looked down and reviewed her work. A spatial reservation spell, she called it, reworked the teleportation charm to essentially reset herself and bring back her region she was more or intrinsically linked to. For her, she meant Ponyville, ideally her castle. The Flam Brothers had been right on track, she thought, working on to circumvent a lack of boundaries by simply blinking out of them. Where they had been lacking, so far she could tell, it was the tentacle acunum to create a strong enough external anchor for their spells. She had written her own notes in the dirt in the center of one of the wildest clearings she could ever find while flying. Satisfied that she had done and what she could do, she rose and dusted herself off. The only thing left to do was practical trials, and yet she hesitated. Her wings twitched, unflurried part away, and she shuffled her hooves uneasily. The shriek had come when she touched her magic, the feeling of being haunted, being noticed, and intensified then too. She couldn't believe the timing was unrelated, but when she didn't have a choice, she just steeled her nerves to begin the test. With a soft rustling blame brought to her head a sound in alarm. There in the pathway leading to her clearing stood the scarecrow. Twilight jumped away, clearing out the space between the single beat of her wings. But she didn't take off though, and allowed herself to settle in the passage opposite of the scarecrow, watching it in teeth set on edge. It didn't move, though it seemed to be swaying slightly, though some pony had only just stood it there on its own 4 stiff legs. But as she watched, its head seemed to twitch. With a soft creak and rasp, its baggy face moved upwards, turning its hollow, shallow eyes towards the sky. Twilight felt her skin go cold, as though her veins in her skin were recoiling from it. It can't be real. It can't be. But the rules have changed. Who knows what's senseless and what was possible? She bit her lip, fighting the urge to move farther away. She hadn't detected anything earlier when she had searched for the sources of magic beyond her own. But with this thing directly before her, there was a lot more for her to work with. She pulled on the tiniest fraction of energy, sending a minute tendril down towards the scarecrow. But with a faint, immediate crackle like a root breaking beneath the spade, it lowered its head, and its empty eyes coming to lock directly on her. Twilight cut her connection to the magic and took instinctively step back, the bile in her empty stomach rising in protest with sight. Every sense, every instinct she had told her to run, but before she could make a decision, the sound of the scarecrow's voice reached her from across the clearing. What? She waited, every muscle tense as a harp string, as her ears strained towards the scarecrow. Was it trying, or was it even possible that it could speak of her? It tilted its head, almost as though puzzled by her. Twilight felt herself waver. One hoof lifted, whatever it was to run or step closer again. She didn't even know. But running, she realized, wouldn't get her any information. And there was no apparent danger, was there? Could that be that she had an opportunity to learn something? What? Twilight's tongue stuck at the roof in her mouth, and she licked her lips. Her throat was having gone suddenly dry. What do you want? Twilight frowned. Was it telling her to be quiet? A warning? She took a careful step forward. When the scarecrow didn't react, she approached it cautiously, stopping a few good jumps away. Can you tell me what this place is? What are you? Why do you look like my friend? The scarecrow stood stone still for a moment, seemingly to regard her. Shh. I don't understand, Twilight growled, feeling the teeth clench together. Are you anything? Can you even understand me? Cube. The blood drained from Twilight's face. No, it couldn't. Cube. Twilight. Twilight's mouth opened, but only for a choked sob emerged. She held her hoof over her mouth, refusing to think, refusing to consider. Her thoughts had fled again, shutting down in the face of the unreal and unthinkable. She lowered her hoof, stepping towards the scarecrow, and stooped her head in to look in his sightless face. Applejack? The scarecrow wobbled, and for a moment it looked like it was going to topple over. Then its foreleg jerked, and it planted its hoof stiffly into the soil, taking a halting step forward. Twilight's throat seemed to squeeze shut, her mind howling that something was wrong. Something was horribly wrong, but she was frozen to the spot obviously. Something was wrong. Twilight, though, everything was wrong. But if she could truly actually be, if it was possible, this was somehow her friend. The voice of Applejack's voice seemed to be getting stronger. Twilight could hear it now, the barest echo of her friend's heartly warmth beneath the covering coarse and desiccating dust. It took another step forward, rolling to the joint with the stick plunged into its shoulder. You fade? What? I don't understand. Applejack, is that actually you? Show me that's really you. The scarecrow stepped up to Twilight. She searched in the pits of her face for any sign of life or movement or expression she could recognize. As Applejack with the blank expansions of orange stared back at her, the only black stitches of its own grin giving nothing away. The strings twitched, stretched, and then began to snap one by one as a tear opened into the creature's face. A mouth crowded with dim shapes and shadows spread open. pulling apart with soft popping stitches. Twilight stared, transfixated. Dimly she realized that the clearing had gone utterly silent. The cicadas were gone, and were in the stillness. Her own breathing suddenly sounded horribly loud and ragged. It took her a moment to realize that it was only hers, and she noticed that from that strange, horrible replica of Applejack. There was no sound of breath at all. "Feed," Applejack whispered, leaning closer to Twilight. "The field." Applejack's head shot forward, her body lunging agilely at Twilight, hadn't imagined that it could have. Before she could flinch, Applejack toppled onto Twilight's shoulder. A sharp, searing pain shot through her. Then Twilight screamed and her hooves flailed, trying to push herself away. But Applejack's face latched onto her shoulder as firmly as a tick. Twilight could feel the skin of her shoulder stretch, tear, and then something deeper down and crunched. The feeling of something scraping. Twilight screamed again, swung her other foreleg up, and slammed her hoof down on the Scarecrow's head with all of her might. She was rewarded only with the infuriating, soft little whoomph as the fabric absorbed from the blow entirely. Though it was in her agony and terror, Twilight had reared again, punching down and down her restrained alicorn muscles, striking down with long enough force to shatter the trunk of the tree. It was like a punching pillow. It accomplished nothing. Applejack's sightless eyes seemed to return Twilight's horrified stare. Her mouth was twisted in a wicked grin. Before the cloth lips sank just a little lower, closer to Twilight's skin, biting down even harder. Twilight opened the channel of magic, spooled in a nexus of energy into focus above her, and then lanced it directly onto the Scarecrow's face. It was a weak blow. Somehow Twilight couldn't bring herself to unleash the all fury of magic on something that resembled Applejack. However monstrous had it become. With a piercing shriek, Applejack released Twilight and stumbled back, filling the clearing with an earthly howl as she pawed and swiped at her own burned face. Twilight felt her side and clutched her shoulder, staring at Applejack in mute shock. The creature staggered and spun and finally toppled over, rolling over and over in the dirt as his stiff limbs causing it to flip and jolt. But Applejack was up again, regaining balance and clattering towards Twilight like a spider. The mouth's gaping grin dangled wide, and Twilight saw now that it was filled with jagged, dripping splinters of wooden teeth, as though someone had driven the sharpenel and smashed into a wall, stuffing the head. Twilight felt her reservations evaporate. This could not be Applejack, and whatever resemblance it bore no longer mattered. Almost without considering, she summoned another burst of power as Applejack galloped towards her. This time she didn't hold back. The Scarecrow disappeared in the bulge of the crackling purple light, hot as the sun and ruthless as a storm. Twilight held the channel in a heartbeat. 2, then 3. Willing Applejack would be gone when the light faded. She then suddenly felt ill at the thought, certain that she was at this point not Applejack. A part of her still recoiled, mortified in what consequences her reckless defense might have been. Even so, she allowed the blaze to ebb only, and she realized that the field was catching fire around her. Blinking several times, pulling herself away to her hooves as she waited for her eyes to readjust to the normal light. A black scar spread out before her, the corn obliterated for as far as she could see. She staggered as she put on weight on her hooves, then looked around momentarily in bafflement when her leg wouldn't move through freely, but she caught in the sight of the wound, 2 crescents pulsing, glistening blood streaming from the jagged lines of torn skin. The pain had returned in full. She gasped and nearly fell again, tears welling up as she stared down at the ruined flesh of her leg. She lifted protectively, and a dark, sickly circle was left behind in the dirt. Her attention was caught by the sound of scraping and shuffling. She turned back and looked at the scar, and her ears fell flat against her skull as she saw something rising from the ashen suit. It no longer faintly resembled Applejack. She had burned beyond recognition, yet it somehow impossibly still retained some of the functional form. Skeletal limbs shuddered upright, and a shrunken, scorched lump rose in the fin of rope of a neck to stare at Twilight. The sense of terror and resolution had returned. The urge to run and get away from the rising grew stronger than ever. Twilight! The mouth parted, squeaking and squealing, with the sounds of bits of coal rubbing together. Feed! Feed! Twilight gathered her magic once more, allowing it to swell around her. As she attempted to focus on it, though, her shoulder flared in agony, causing her to wobble in her remaining good legs, and then the magic drained away, dissipating into the soil like water. At the same moment, the thing lying in the field lurched upright, screaming in a higher and thinner and more grating pitch than ever before. Twilight had just enough time to leap into the sky. She clutched her shoulder with her hoof and jaw clenched, and her eyes focusing mainly shut at the speed of her ascent. Her only thought was to get away from this thing as she possibly could. What's up, my pretties? It's the Lion Queen here. I want to appreciate you all for tuning into this video, and I do appreciate you guys supporting my video by giving this video likes and stuff. If you really enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, comment and subscribe if you're new, ring the bell for notifications to when I upload so that way you guys will get updated for whenever I upload. If you want to follow me on Twitter or DeviantArt, feel free to leave a follow on those if you are interested in following me on those socials. If you want to support my backup channel, known as Miss Dark Shigo, feel free to subscribe to it, as a link to that will also be in the About page section. And with that being said, and that being the case, thank you so much for watching, my pretties, and as always, please stay pretty.